A few years ago, a group of activists organized a protest in Boston demanding that Renoir be removed from all museums. Supposedly, Renoir is the most overrated artist in history, and his work is not worthy of museums. God hates Renoir, they shouted. Renoir himself called himself a float man. And today I will tell you a fascinating and somewhat sad story about an Impressionist, the best friend of Claude Monet, a rival, a renegade, a pauper, and in the end, a wealthy man, Pierre-Auguste. Renoir was born in 1841, a year after Monet, into the family of a poor tailor and was the sixth child. When he was 3 years old, the Renoir family moved to Paris and settled there. Where do you think? In the courtyard of the Louvre, in houses for the poor. The thing is, Henry built these houses for aristocrats 250 years before Renoir was born, but over time they fell into disrepair and became social housing for the poor. That's how the life of young Auguste began, surrounded by poverty right next to the splendor of the Louvre. In those days, as soon as children were able to carry things, they started helping their families, and at the age of 13, Auguste got a job at a porcelain factory, where he began painting dishes. His artistic abilities quickly became apparent, and he was given increasingly complex work. Eventually, he was allowed to paint not just flowers on vases, but to depict scenes with human figures on them. In his free time, he often visited the nearby Louvre, and although he was more interested in sculptures, over time he became attracted to the works of François Boucher, Antoine Watteau, and Fragonard, and he starts copying them. By that time, he was already earning a decent income and was able to buy himself painting supplies. Back then, any young painter would start by copying the great artists of the past, and the Louvre was the perfect place for that. Renoir worked at the factory until he was 17, until the factory owner bought a machine that printed designs on dishes mechanically. Such designs were always identical, the machine didn't make mistakes, and people liked them more. It should be noted that the works of the young Renoir were not very popular with people, nor was the artist himself, but I'll talk about that a little later. After losing his job, Renoir developed a lifelong hatred for technological progress, which was spreading across the world and became a blessing for some and a curse for others. Renoir had very conservative views, and soon this would be reflected in his creative path as well. However, after being fired from the factory, he didn't give up trying to earn a living through painting and began offering his wall painting services to various cafes. He would find smoky, untidy cafes and offer to paint them, with payment only after the work was done, saying it definitely wouldn't look worse and pointing to the grimy walls. Some owners agreed, and he decorated their walls with vulgar scenes featuring clouds and Venuses. Around the same time, he began painting his first pictures, but real earnings came from another type of painting, curtain painting. He charged 30 francs per curtain and managed to paint up to 3 a day. This money was enough for him to start saving. At the same time, he attended a free city art school. There was no question of any help from his parents, and as you can see, Renoir had to earn a living for himself and pay for his own education since he was 13 years old. 4 years after painting curtains in 1862, when he was 21, he made the most defining choice of his life. He enrolled in the art studio of Charles Gleyre, the very same studio where a year later, 3 more young artists would join, artists who would soon revolutionize the art world. And this meeting would become truly fateful for the young Auguste. The money he had saved turned out to be enough to pay for it. But soon Gleyre, seeing the young man's talent, refuses to take any money from him. And here I will pause a bit to talk about Renoir's personality. This will be very important for us to understand the motives behind his actions and the changes his art underwent later on. Renoir was always a quiet and reserved person. He worked in the farthest corner of Gleyre's studio, trying not to interact with the other students. He was thin, angular, even prickly, and at first glance nobody liked him. He even seemed off-putting to people. His son recalls that this was one of the biggest problems in Renoir's life. It was very difficult for him to make contact with new people. However, as soon as people got to know him better, they inevitably grew fond of him. And also, in his mature years, in conversations with his son, he called himself a float, a man who goes with the flow. He advised his son to be a float, to behave in life like a float carried by the current of a stream. And it was very difficult for Renoir during the technological revolution, when almost every year there was some new discovery that amazed people and changed their lives. Locomotives, photography, new lands, factories, electricity, all of this appeared at that time. Yes, watch my video about Impressionism to find out how technological progress made Impressionism itself possible. I'll leave a link in the description. Renoir studied in Gleyre's studio for about a year when 3 more young artists joined as students: Claude, Alfred, and Frederick. Thin and nervous, Renoir worked carelessly in his corner and was struck by the confident, aristocratic manners and virtuosity of one of the newcomers' works. They were complete opposites and would soon become best friends. It was none other than the young Claude Monet, who, with his boundless energy, literally shook up Gleyre's studio. The other two, as you have probably already guessed, were Alfred Sisley and Frederick Bazille. It was these 4 who would become the core of Impressionism, and it was this meeting that would determine the fate and creative path of each of them, and as a result the world of art as well. Manet and Renoir quickly became close. Both admired each other's skill, although in Manet's opinion, Renoir lacked boldness. But most importantly, both were as poor as church mice. Sisley and Bazille came from aristocratic families. Painting was not a matter of survival for them, but on the other hand, this allowed them not to be afraid to experiment. Their budget didn't collapse with every unsold painting. They were financially independent and could take risks. Monet and Renoir already had to constantly look for money, and every failure, which often resulted from their experiments, was painful for them. And they decided to rent a place together. They rented a tiny studio and slept on mattresses thrown on the floor. They bought a 50-kilogram bag of beans and boiled them 3 times a day, heating the room at the same time and inviting people over for stew so they wouldn't have to use extra coal. The shivering naked girl, the model, was always shared between the 2 of them so they could split her fee. This friendship would probably become the most important one in the history of art. Well, maybe also marriage and Picasso? Check out my video about Picasso for more on that. I'll leave a link. And this will give us a unique opportunity to compare 2 paths, 2 perspectives, 2 obsessions that ran parallel for a long time but ended so differently. 4 young artists start meeting outside the studio. All of them, riding the wave of change that the world around them is boiling with, are charged to accomplish something groundbreaking. By that time, the art world had become completely stagnant. The Paris Academy of Arts kept a close watch to ensure there was no free thinking. Everything had to strictly follow the rules of academic painting, just as the great masters had decreed 300 years ago. It also controlled the Paris Salon, the annual and only exhibition for artists through which one could achieve fame and financial success. And of course, our 4 did not like all these restrictions at all. They meet every day at the Parisian Café Closerie and argue to exhaustion, discussing modern trends and how the stifling academic painting has long needed a good kick. The driving force of this group is, of course, Manet. He's just obsessed with painting, with nature, with plain air. All 4 of them start going out and meeting in the forest of Fontainebleau to paint from nature. Here it's important to note the difference between the artists. Renoir was initially most interested in portraits and depicting people, while Manet was more attracted to depicting nature. His boisterous temperament seemed to demand a quick painting technique, energetic, just like Impressionism would become. Renoir, on the other hand, was more passive. He was more comfortable carefully painting facial features than trying to capture the constantly changing nature. He recalls that he literally had to persuade Manet to visit the Louvre. But even there, Manet ignored all the portraits and paid attention only to the landscapes. At the same time, in another, much more prestigious studio at the Académie Suisse, 2 other future Impressionists, Paul Cézanne and Camille Pissarro, were dealing with exactly the same problems as Renoir and his friends. Bazille, being a man from high society, knew them and soon introduced the 2 groups, which allowed them to form a kind of community of young rebellious artists, and they called themselves the Intransigents. Despite the difficult financial situation, Renoir, unlike Manet, remembers this time with great warmth. "I have never been happier in my life. I must admit that Manet occasionally managed to beg for a dinner, and we stuffed ourselves with turkey and truffles, washing it down with chambertin." A little earlier, an event important for artists, though unnoticed by the rest of the world, took place. The aluminum paint tube was invented. Before that, paints had to be ground right on the spot, otherwise they would quickly harden, so artists couldn't go far from their studios. Tubes with caps made it possible to transport paints as far as you wanted. And this gave a boost to painting outdoors in plein air, which became a shared passion for all 6 future Impressionists, soon to be joined by the 7th, Bertha Morisot. Here's how Renoir recalls this period, and in his words we can already see the beginning of that very struggle between innovation and conservatism, which would later separate Renoir from the other uncompromising artists. He recalls, "This is why I agree to use paints in tubes. I am once again a floater. My passivity is rewarded." It was the portability of paints in tubes that allowed us to paint so freely outdoors. Without paints in tubes, there would be no Cézanne, Monet, Sisley, Pissarro. There would be nothing that journalists called Impressionism. That doesn't stop me from hating the metric system, which replaced inventions of the human mind with measurements suggested by nature, inch, foot, ell, and league. And meanwhile, everyone in the world continues to communicate and enrich each other with ideas. It was precisely this brotherhood that became the foundation which allowed them to dare to go against the system, something that would have been absolutely impossible to overthrow alone. I'm preparing a video about each member of this amazing group, so subscribe so you don't miss it, and check out the video about Monet. I'll leave a link in the description. Renoir was probably the calmest of this group of 7. His participation in the group was somewhat passive, almost accidental. Nevertheless, the turbulent waters of rebellion and adventurism, as well as Man's influence, inevitably drew him into the current that would soon be called Impressionism. Later, he recalled, "I always surrendered myself to the mercy of fate. I never had the temperament of a fighter, and I would have given up in many cases if it weren't for my old friend Maine, the one who truly has the temperament of a fighter, if he hadn't been there to get me back on my feet again." But it's very hard for them. The friends constantly have to move from one place to another in search of cheaper housing. Sometimes they just don't pay the rent and run away. Sometimes Basil and Cecily help them out with money. And often, it's only friendship that supports the artist in their joint effort to become great. At this time, Renoir goes back to painting curtains just to make ends meet, and he starts painting portraits, becoming more and more fascinated by them. But for now, he doesn't charge money for them, mostly painting his friends and their relatives. Since 1864, Renoir has had the right to participate in the Paris Salon. He paints a picture for it called Esmeralda, inspired by the character from Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The painting is accepted. It's almost unbelievable. The following year, he sends a work there called Portrait of William Sisley, the wealthy father of his companion Alfred Sisley Renoir. In fact, each of the next 14 years, until 1890, when he achieves success, he will participate in the Paris Salon. He will be rejected 4 times, but 10 of his paintings will be accepted. And this will play a significant role in his success. Monet, as you may remember from the video about him, also participated in the Salon, but only out of necessity, just to earn money. For Renoir, however, participating in the Salon was more natural. Portraits and Salon-style paintings suited him better than landscapes, and besides, they sold better. If you establish yourself as a good portraitist, you'll get commissions. And who needs experimental, incomprehensible paintings by a young upstart artist rejected by the Paris Salon? No one. And both friends will have to make a choice every day for many years to come, to paint what their soul desires or what sells well. What would be the right thing to do? Should you try to convince a stubborn and blind world that you can paint differently, or should you bend to it and give it what it wants? And Renoir continues, like a young portrait artist after the Paris Salon, now having the opportunity to sell portraits. He charges only 20 or 30 francs for them, and sometimes he even accepts payment in goods. Monet, together with the others, is just at this time mastering a new technique that will soon be called Impressionism. It consists of depicting what the artist sees right now with the minimum number of brushstrokes. Not painting every single leaf and reflection on the water, but using just a few skillfully and precisely placed brushstrokes. To outline objects, light, shadows, and to convey the weather and even the mood. And Renoir, of course, succumbs to the charm of his friend and becomes fascinated by the ideas that he promotes within the group of the irreconcilables. They had long since left Gleyre's group, but even here, Monet rebelled in his own way against Gleyre's instructions to flatter the model and embellish her, and he left, encouraging the others to do the same. Renoir, on the other hand, stayed for almost another year until Gleyre closed his studio due to health reasons. Renoir, unlike Monet, deeply regretted this, and soon we will see that Renoir did, in fact, learn how to flatter the model. In 1865, at the home of his friend, the artist Jules Lacarrière, he met 16-year-old Lise Tréault. She would soon become Renoir's lover and his favorite model. And importantly, for an artist with limited means, she was also a free model. Now, in addition to his natural inclination for portrait painting, Renoir also had a model on whom he could hone his skills. As you can see, there are no signs of Impressionism in his works yet, but they are about to appear. The whole group of artists, in various combinations, often travels to Fontainebleau. They rent a house together in the village of Marlotte. It's 60 kilometers from Paris. Sometimes they make the whole journey on foot, spending the night in the small town of Essonne. They are simply obsessed with landscapes, the changing light, and of course with arguments, discussions, and developing new techniques. Why Fontainebleau? Of course, because its landscapes are very dramatic. But most of all, the artists were interested in the sunbeams, the light filtering through the leaves and falling to the forest floor. They were interested in a new way of depicting the space beneath the trees. When patches of light fall on objects from below, and even without seeing the sun, we understand that it's somewhere up there. But in reality, patches of light form a pattern familiar to the eye, and to arrange them naturally, you need to study the patterns, which is exactly what our rebels did. Essentially, they discovered this effect, these patches, because classical painting in landscapes paid no attention to light spots, nor could it. All landscapes were painted in studios. Renoir recalls how they all admired, I quote, the slenderness of the trunks of the great beeches and the blue, streaming light of the foliage covering them like a vault, as if you were at the bottom of the sea among the masts of sunken ships. Soon they would apply this technique to urban sketches and scenes of Parisian social life, and this technique would become the hallmark of Impressionism. The artists do not always work together, and very often Renoir works alone. He works so intensely, almost motionless, that even the deer eventually get used to his frozen posture and dare to approach the strange creature moving a stick over a piece of cardboard. On one such day, the deer suddenly scattered in fright, and Renoir realized that he was not alone. After a while, a ragged, frightening-looking man came out of the bushes. Staggering, he approached Renoir and asked him for some bread, saying he hadn't eaten in 2 days. It turned out that he was a Republican journalist wanted by Napoleon's police. Let me remind you, the late 1860s was a time of crisis for Napoleon's monarchy, when the emergence of many factories led to a significant increase in the working class, but their living conditions were terrible. This would soon lead to the October Revolution of 1870, when the monarchy in France would be finally abolished. Well, for now, the gendarmes are chasing after the Republicans, trying to root out revolutionary ideas at their very source. Renoir's guest was named Raoul Rego, and Renoir shared his food and clothes with him and took him to their home. Rego will spend 2 weeks with the artists, and then Cézanne will contact his friends, and they will help him get to England. And this random encounter will soon turn out to be an incredibly fortunate rescue for Renoir. At this time, Durand-Ruel, the first art dealer in history, appears in their lives. I talk a lot about this man, and I'll say it again, without him, art would have been different. He literally falls in love with Monet and starts buying his paintings in advance, even without the possibility of selling them. But with foresight, understanding in advance that they have a future. At Monet's insistence, he also buys Renoir's paintings. By supporting two impoverished artists, Durand-Ruel creates conditions for the artists to experiment. Renoir and Monet are almost inseparable, and we are approaching a unique situation. When two great artists not only painted similar subjects, they painted the same subject at the same time, just a few steps away from each other. I'm talking about the famous frog pond paintings, two almost identical works that Monet and Renoir painted in 1869. Renoir was already 28 years old. By this time, a monograph on the color wheel and the influence of colors on each other had been published, and the friends discover another principle of Impressionism, reflections. This principle says that the color of an object is never pure. It is always tinted by the reflection of the colors of nearby objects, and even the color of the lighting itself changes its palette. I talk about this in detail in the video about Monet and Impressionism. Check it out, I won't repeat myself here. By this time, the artists no longer lived together, but they lived nearby in a place called Bougival, not far from Paris, and very often they go out to the Seine to paint outdoors together. And now we can compare how, even back then, the technique and perspective of the two artists differed when painting the same subject. It will be very interesting. The painting depicts a very popular place, a floating restaurant and a small island on the Seine. The name Frog Pond, however, did not come from actual frogs. Back then, that was simply what they called women of easy virtue, who really loved this place. Of course, this was also one of the main reasons why gentlemen loved it as well. Look, here we can clearly see that the artists were standing next to each other. Their technique is very similar. They both use the new Impressionist manner of depicting figures and water, where each highlight is not meticulously drawn, but indicated with one or two brush strokes, each clearly placed in its own spot. But Monet pays primary attention to depicting the water. He is not interested in the forest in the background, he indicates it with a single light green spot. He is not interested in the figures of people, he just sketches them in. We can still tell that there are people there, but as for the water, notice here, every highlight is carefully painted. Look at the colors in the reflection. There's nothing extra, just the light green of the forest reflection, the blue of the sky's reflection, white highlights and brown shadows, that's all. And we see the water, the rhythmic ripples and the reflection of the little island, boats and people all indicated with just simple strokes. And let's take a look at Renoir's version. See, he paints the forest in much more detail and pays special attention to the people. He is more interested in the figures of people than in anything else in the painting. And compared to Monet, his figures turn out to be much more interesting. But he doesn't manage to paint water as well as Monet does. Renoir makes everything too complicated here. The detailed forest in the background forces him to mix different shades of green, even in the reflection on the water. This blurs the surface, making it dull and loose. Renoir doesn't make the water follow the rhythm of the waves. In his painting, it seems to move in different directions at the same time. And all this makes it harder to perceive the water as realistically as the sparse, concise brush strokes of Monet could. Renoir essentially sacrifices the realism of the water to achieve more detail in the depiction of the forest and the figures of people. And already here we can see the emerging difference between the two artists who were the same age, friends, and went through the same school. I won't get tired of repeating it. To understand an artist's work, you need to get to know the artist himself, what drives him, what motives inspire him, and what tragedies he has experienced in his life. The paintings of any artist, and especially an impressionist, are a projection not only of his skill, but also of his feelings, his vision, and what he wants to show us. And comparing two identical frog ponds perfectly illustrates that there are no two identical artists. Each of them, looking at the same thing, sees something different. You can only see this in a museum, so be sure to go and look at the Impressionist paintings up close to marvel at the precision and virtuosity of the geniuses. Renoir doesn't paint landscapes very often. It's not his main passion, but there's another aspect. No matter how friendly the relationships between artists are, they always remain rivals. And to play on the same field as Monet, who is bright, skillful, and often unchallengeable, means to lose in advance. It's a friendly competition. Artists, no matter how humble they are, always have one goal in life: to become famous. Always being in the shadow of your brilliant friend is a challenge only for those who believe in their own talent and destiny. And Renoir gradually begins to move away from painting landscapes and focuses more on scenes with people. Landscapes will become very rare in his future work, but in portrait painting he will become famous, and in a few years he will even receive the Legion of Honor. This will greatly upset Monet. However, his practice with Monet and the intransigence is not in vain. And many nuances of the Impressionist approach will migrate into his portraits, which will make his style unique. After the Frog Pond, he hardly paints landscapes anymore, but finds his challenge in portrait painting. And while Monet works on enlarging his brushstroke, Renoir goes in the opposite direction. His brushstroke becomes finer, more feathery. He applies paint in a thin layer. Unlike Monet's bold, thick strokes, Renoir begins to realize that the Impressionist manner is better suited for landscapes, but for portraits, something different is needed. More precise. If he wants to paint commissioned portraits, they have to resemble the original. At that time, no one was ready to buy portraits in which even close relatives couldn't recognize the model. The public expects a likeness, and the more the better. Around this time, another characteristic feature appears for the first time in almost all of his subsequent portraits, for which he is still heavily criticized to this day. Black eyes like beads. The models in almost all of his portraits have these eyes. It's a very successful technique that gives the model's gaze a sense of depth. And we, recalling Člověk Poplavok and the teachings of the first master, understand that this is the case. Renoir flatters his models. He basically invented his own filter, and satisfied models will order again and tell others about him. At the same time, Renoir begins to realize that the Impressionist maxim of not using black in paintings doesn't work for his portraits. Renoir was never the most revolutionary of the revolutionaries in art anyway. He just wanted to paint portraits and make a living from it. And it turns out that this type of painting is the most in demand among the nobility. And the path to success is very clear and has long been paved by other artists. Make a name for yourself by exhibiting at salons, become fashionable, and then the clients will come on their own. That's why Renoir is much more persistent than all the other Impressionists. Every year he applies to the salon, and every time he receives approval. He's just starting to get recognized. But then the Franco-Prussian War begins, and Renoir has to take a break. He joins the cavalry regiment, just like Basile, who, unfortunately, is killed by the end of the war. I'll talk about Basile very soon. Subscribe. Renoir makes it through the entire war unharmed and returns to Paris, by which time all his artist friends have already left the city. And in 1870, after the defeat in the war, that very September Revolution takes place in France. If before the gendarmes were chasing revolutionaries, now the Republicans who have seized power are searching everywhere for monarchy spies. One fine day, Renoir was standing with his easel on the bank of the Seine, and a Republican patrol was passing by him. Seeing the unfamiliar Impressionist landscape, the patrolman decided that Renoir couldn't be a real artist. And he suspected that he was a spy preparing a plan of the embankment for an enemy landing, so Renoir was dragged off to the town hall without any discussion. The 6th district of Paris, where a garrison was always on duty to execute spies. Renoir was already being led to execution when he saw that very forest fugitive whom he and his friends had saved. Only this time he was already important, dressed in a uniform and surrounded by subordinates. The artist called out to him, and Raoul Rego rushed to Renoir, embraced him, and ordered him to be released immediately. He invited the artist to the balcony and ordered the Marseillaise to be played in his honor. He released him, providing him with a special pass that allowed Renoir to move freely around Paris. That's how it is, friends. You never know how a good deed might come back to you and return the favor, sometimes even to all of humanity. Do you understand what times have come? The technological revolution overlapped with the social revolution, creating a perfect storm. Within a few years, the entire familiar life of Parisians changed fundamentally, and only one area of social life remained preserved and clung to the past: painting. And now we have rebellious artists returning to Paris. Could it not have occurred to them to give the Paris Academy of Arts a good kick? Could they not have tried to stage a revolution in their own field as well? Those were difficult times. After the defeat in the war, France entered an economic crisis. Paintings stopped selling, and even Durand-Ruel could no longer support the artists. Renoir did not stop trying to apply to the Paris Salon, but after 1869 he received rejection after rejection. And although Renoir, thanks to his portraits and a more conservative approach to painting, was a bit more successful than his peers, he was still desperately short of money. Therefore, in the early 70s, after several rejections from the Salon, Renoir once again joined the group of irreconcilables. In fact, he had a patron, the wealthy philanthropist Charpentier, whom he met in 1869, but Renoir did not want to publicize their acquaintance, fearing accusations of being mercenary. And all of them came up with a terrible idea: to organize their own exhibition, creating a new community of artists, which they gave the jaw-breaking name Anonymous Cooperative Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. In French, it sounds even more terrible. This historic exhibition, now known as the First Impressionist Exhibition, took place in 1874 and, according to the participants' plan, was meant to shame academic art and compete with the Paris Salon. Renoir, who had already turned 33, he submitted 6 of his paintings to this exhibition, including the famous dancer and the books. It is from this exhibition and its loud negative criticism that the birth of the Impressionist movement is usually counted. The exhibition was a huge success, but most people went there mainly out of curiosity and to laugh at the upstarts. The critic Leroy wrote an ironic and extremely popular essay in which he called the artists Impressionists, based on the title of Monet's painting Impression Sunrise, which by the way was suggested to Monet by Renoir himself. So this mocking and soon respectful name Impressionists stuck to them, known to us now as Impressionism after Monet's painting, a name that was invented by Renoir. But no matter how much the artists tried to put on a brave face, in reality it was a failure. They managed to sell only a few paintings for 300 francs and Impression for 800, which was bought by Monet's patron. And the irreconcilable ones, the following year, in 75, decided to hold an auction of their paintings, following Durand Ruel's idea. The public caused a scandal, someone called Bertha Morisot a harlot, and Pissarro slapped them in the face. A fight broke out, and they had to call the police. However, not a single painting was sold. I'll quote an excerpt from a critical article that accompanied the auction, so you can clearly understand how the Impressionists were perceived. At that time, Ulice Lepeliti was out of luck. After the Opera House fire, a new disaster struck this neighborhood. At Durand Ruel's, they opened an exhibition that people say is supposed to be painting. An unsuspecting passerby drawn in by the flags decorating the facade enters and a terrifying sight unfolds before his startled eyes. 5 or 6 madmen, including one woman, a pitiful group of lunatics afflicted by vanity, have gathered there to exhibit their creations. There are people who burst out laughing at such a sight. As for me, it makes my heart ache. These so-called artists call themselves uncompromising. They take a canvas, paints and brushes, slap on a few strokes however they please, and sign their name. In the asylum for the mentally ill in Villevrard, those who have lost their minds pick up pebbles from the road and imagine they've found diamonds. A terrifying sight of human pride that has grown into madness. Yesterday, on Lepelette Street, an unfortunate man who, after leaving the exhibition, was biting passers-by, was detained. This is what our relentless ones had to deal with. If Monet was the center of criticism and such a reaction only excited him, he believed that all geniuses were unrecognized. And it would even be alarming if it were the other way around. But Renoir was hardly criticized at all, and this upset him greatly. His works were the most timid and comfortable, and critics simply ignored him. He said, "I wasn't recognized. It's very troubling when people don't want to know you." After the exhibition and the scathing criticism, Renoir's already modest portrait sales collapsed completely. No one wanted to commission a painting from a man who had been ridiculed, misunderstood, and outcast. Charpentier had already covered all his walls with Renoir's paintings, and Durand Ruel still hadn't recovered from the financial crisis that hit France after the defeat in the war. Overall, the first Impressionist exhibition did Renoir more harm than good. But right nearby, artists recognized by the Salon were flooded with commissions and money, building expensive houses for themselves, taking on students, and opening their own schools. It's a tough choice, you have to admit, and Renoir starts drifting towards studio painting instead of painting outdoors. He writes, "In the end, a painting is made to be viewed indoors, with windows that often create false lighting. That's why some studio work should be added to painting outdoors. You have to detach yourself from the intoxication of real light and carefully check your impressions in the subdued lighting of a room. Then go outside again to soak up the sun. By moving from one to the other like this, you start to achieve something." And soon Renoir, already quite weary from rebellion, paints one of his last Impressionist works capturing an outdoor scene, the famous ball at the Moulin de la Galette. Such paintings became very popular after Edouard Manet's scandalous luncheon on the grass. Claude Monet played with this theme back in 65 and Renoir turned to it in 76. And it will be very interesting for us to study it. The painting was exhibited at the Third Impressionist exhibition in 1877. It is considered Renoir's main work of the 1870s. As usual, I will draw your attention to the most important things. In every painting, the artist sets a challenge for himself, solves an interesting problem, and in this canvas, it was important for Renoir to accomplish the most difficult task, naturally to arrange the spots of light breaking through the foliage. As you remember from the exercises of the uncompromising Fontainebleau, this was exactly what fascinated the Impressionists most in such scenes. His friends posed for the painting. In the foreground, we see 3 people, two dark-eyed women, and a man sitting with his back to us. It is believed that Renoir did a good job, but take a look at the man's back. On it, we see 5 almost identical, perfectly round spots arranged in an almost checkerboard pattern. But that doesn't happen in nature, you have to agree. For this effect, the man would have had to sit under a colander. He has exactly the same spots on his head. The woman in the striped, very fashionable dress at the time turned out better. She is the center of the composition, while her friend is dressed in a dark spot. In the center of the painting, there's a dancing couple, and here, Renoir needed to convey perspective. And the light spots should get smaller, but that doesn't happen. This part of the painting is also criticized for the ground, with people saying it looks like the couple is dancing on a cloud. And although the painting conveys the mood of the scene in an impressionist way, the main technical challenge for Renoir was not successful here. We see the same thing in his later painting, The Swing. The pattern of light spots on the ground is too rhythmic and orderly, as if the scene were happening under a grid, and the shadows on the ground are too uniform and large. And they create more of a sense of a wavy surface, rather than the play of light filtering through the foliage. This painting would become one of the last by Renoir to depict this effect, and soon the artist began to move away from the Impressionist style of painting. He never returns to the attempt to depict sunlight spots again. He sometimes paints landscapes and still lifes, but for the most part, he focuses on portraits. At the same time, his brushwork during this period becomes very fine, the portraits become almost blended, and the outlines of the figures seem somewhat blurred. And these are the first paintings in which Renoir's future unique style emerges: gentle colors, feathery small brush strokes, and blurred silhouettes. It's as if we see a decisive rejection of the large, contrasting brushstrokes of the Impressionists. Since the late 70s, Renoir no longer participated in Impressionist exhibitions. He focused entirely on the salon to make a name for himself. But he doesn't forget the Impressionist legacy. Instead, he reinterprets it as if compressing and reducing the brushstroke, thereby achieving a unique effect of softness. His heroines appear as if surrounded by a halo of radiance, and this, along with their bead-like eyes, of course, appeals to the public much more than Manet's sweeping landscapes. In that same year, 1877, he painted a portrait of Jana Samary, whom he met at Charpentier's and absolutely adored, considering her the most charming actress in Paris. And it's hard to argue with him, you have to agree. The portrait is now hanging in the Pushkin Museum. Go see it if you get the chance. Jana Samary was an actress at the Comédie Théâtre, and Renoir painted 4 portraits of her. But this one, exhibited at the 3rd Impressionist exhibition, is, in my opinion, truly impressive and is the most Impressionist work in Renoir's entire career. Look here, the brushstrokes are quite broad and sweeping, and the colors are light in the Impressionist style, but our attention is still drawn to the eyes. Little beads, into which he added some blue. Renoir's fellow artists harshly criticized the portrait for being vulgar, superficial, and excessively sweet. Degas even mocked his friend's style, calling it chubby. But as we can already see, many of Renoir's portraits could be called sweet. Sweetness sells, and Renoir himself likes it. And he was already tired of Impressionism. I think this perfectly characterizes Renoir's state of mind. At this time, there was a funny scene at the theater. They were in a box together with Émile Zola. And he started a conversation about painting. Renoir, who by that time was already tired of theoretical arguments about painting. He turned to Hortense Schneider, who was sitting nearby and was also barely suppressing her yawns. All this is, of course, very nice, he said to her, but let's focus on more serious matters. How is your chest? Is it holding up well? What kind of question is that? Laughed the prima donna in response and opened her bodice, letting him see the firmness of her charms. And Marzolia blushed and ran out of the box. At this time, France is coming out of the crisis, and Durand-Ruel appears on the horizon again. He starts buying Monet's and Renoir's paintings again, supporting the artists and keeping them afloat. Renoir's first success comes in 1879 when Charpentier, his patron with whom he maintained a warm relationship, organizes a solo exhibition for him at his own expense. That same year, his painting Portrait of Madame Charpentier with Children is exhibited at the Salon with great success. It's hard to call it Impressionist, and that works in its favor. Renoir, unlike his uncompromising friend Manet, tries to find a delicate balance between the ideas of Impressionism and classical painting, not daring to completely abandon innovative ideas, but also not getting too carried away with them so as not to reduce the marketability of his portraits. The early 1880s marked the beginning of financial success for Renoir and Monet. It will take another 10 years of patience and ridicule, but his success will be so overwhelming that it will outshine all other contemporary artists, and a rift will come between the friends. But more on that later. Renoir said, "You go with the flow. Those who want to swim against it are either madmen or the proud, or even worse, destroyers. From time to time, you steer a little to the right or left, but always following the direction of the current." That was Renoir's eternal reputation. And what would you choose, friends? A resounding success at 50 or a moderate one but already at 40? Write in the comments, it will be very interesting to discuss. Since the early 80s, Renoir almost completely moved away from Impressionism, and I will show you a painting he created in 81 that marks the end of Renoir's Impressionist period with outdoor scenes. This painting is the luncheon of the boating party, and now we will compare this painting with Dance at le Moulin de la Galette and see how Renoir's style evolved over 5 years. It would be interesting to organize the actual event depicted in the painting. Renoir is helped by his friend, a former ambassador to Thailand, Renoir. He is no longer desperate, but still poor. He has only 3 suits and a couple of shirts, and he eats at dairy shops. These are nice places where the owners of the dairy shops offer customers a snack made right there. It was in such a place that Renoir met the pretty seamstress Alina Chergaud, his future wife and closest person, whom he considered the ideal of beauty. Alina Chergaud would become Renoir's favorite model, and it is her we see petting the dog, in the foreground of the luncheon of the boating party. Look, this is a very similar scene in the garden, but here Renoir is no longer playing with spots of light. There simply aren't any. He places all the characters under a canopy, eliminating the need to reproduce the play of light. What interested the Impressionist the most no longer interests him. The brushstroke has become more confident and precise. It's as if the glass has been wiped clean, bringing everything into sharp focus. Renoir pays much more attention to detail here. I would even say he focuses on them. Look, there is a table with drinks here and there. But while at the ball the artist depicts them almost schematically, here he draws every detail as if it were a separate still life. The faces and figures of the people are painted in detail, regardless of where they are in the composition. Even the most distant characters do not lose their detail, unlike in the ball, where the background figures are just blotches. But most importantly, there is no attempt here to minimize the number of brushstrokes or make them larger. On the contrary, Gribtsov's breakfast is already almost academic classicism, and only the bushes in the background timidly remind us of Impressionism. Renoir's fully Impressionist period ends after his first trip abroad. After his success at the Salon and a rather successful exhibition organized for him by Durand-Ruel, Renoir's financial situation improved. He finally sells several paintings for good money. And what does a person do when they get their first disposable income? He goes on a trip, and Renoir sets off for Algeria. And there he discovers the color white, which was used to paint the minarets and huts. And most importantly, what captivated him was the absence of technological progress, which, in his opinion, destroys the beauty of innocence. And then he goes to Italy, where he sees the masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance with his own eyes. And in Naples, an artistic discovery takes place, which, according to him, justified the entire journey. It was the painting of Pompeii, exhibited in the Naples Museum. He recalls, "The Italians have no merit in creating great painting. It was enough for them to just look around. Italian streets are teeming with pagan deities and biblical characters. Any woman here who is breastfeeding a child is a Raphael Madonna." He is fascinated by the simplicity of the palette of Italian artists, the restraint of the colors, which are very close to real life. He is struck by the realization that they didn't even think about any theories or revolutions in art. They simply painted what they saw around them. With simple paints and simple techniques, without excessive complexity or theories of light, they created masterpieces. On this trip, Renoir seems to receive support for a desire that has been growing inside him for a long time, but which he did not dare to express. He was tired of complicated art, of theorizing, of the hopeless competition with Monet and the other irreconcilables. He was like a float caught in a whirlpool formed by 2 opposing currents from which it was impossible to escape. And Italy offers him a stick grabbing onto which he can get out of this madhouse called Impressionism, which keeps unsuccessfully banging on the closed doors of the public's hearts. And the almost 40-year-old Renoir grabs onto this stick. Italy gives him the strength to say no. Upon returning to Paris, Renoir completely changes the style of his paintings, and a period begins that Renoir himself would later call sour. And art historians call it the Ingres period, after Renoir's inspiration, the French academic painter Jean Ingres. The most famous example of this period and of Renoir is the large bathers. And this, as you can see, is a kind of Frankenstein, where the background is Impressionist and the foreground with the women is typical academic classicism. The subject, the style, and the poses of the women copy the old masters. Here, Renoir completely abandons the visible individual brushstroke, returning to smooth tonal transitions, which are meant to most accurately convey the bodies, to copy them as identically as possible to the object. Exactly the kind of style that the Impressionists considered outdated, boring, and requiring no imagination. And I admit it also seems a bit boring and even somewhat sour to me, as Renoir himself would later say. We've seen thousands like this and painted with much greater skill. And such apostasy does not go unnoticed by Monet and the irreconcilables, and the friendship between them begins to cool. I'm drawing these parallels with Monet's life for you on purpose because he was the person who influenced Renoir the most. And it's incredibly interesting to observe the difference in their development. Monet and Renoir are still very close friends and often go on trips together to paint outdoors. But in 1883, Monet decides for the first time to go to the south of France to Badegé without Renoir secretly from him. He warns Durand-Ruel, "I would like to ask you not to tell anyone about this trip because I want to make it alone. As much as I enjoy traveling with Renoir as a tourist, I would feel uncomfortable traveling with him if I were working. From my own experience, I've always worked better alone. Since Renoir knows that I'm planning to leave, he'll probably want to come with me, which would be a disaster for both of us. I'm sure you'll agree." As you can see, Monet still sees Renoir as a friend to go have fun with as a tourist, but no longer considers him a suitable partner for working together. And it probably couldn't have been any other way. These two artists had personalities that were too different, they had very different strengths, and their visions and desires were too different as well. The float man and the storm man. No, Renoir doesn't completely abandon the Impressionist style. He still paints portraits, but he earns his living and gains fame with paintings that are much less revolutionary. And realizing that blindly copying what you see is already an idea of the past, Renoir, as if justifying himself, liked to tell an anecdote about Apelles, the Athenian painter, emphasizing that even in copying, there is room for genius. Go ahead, tell it. At one of the competitions in the Acropolis, a painter who was a rival of Apelles presented a painting that was supposed to surpass all the other works, including those of Apelles. The painting depicted grapes. They were made so perfectly that birds would fly up to the painting. Trying to peck at the bunches, Apelles winked meaningfully. "Well, you'll see what happens when I show you my painting." And he presented his masterpiece. He said that the painting was hidden behind this curtain. The jury members tried to pull the curtain aside, but in vain, because the curtain itself was the painting of the great master. Renoir's new painting style, much more familiar and understandable, is quite to the liking of the public, critics, portrait clients, and academics. There are still 8 years left until the first real success of the Impressionists, and during all these years Renoir becomes more and more successful, moving along a parallel path. His paintings are bought not only by Durand-Ruel, who will eventually acquire a total of 1,500 of Renoir's works, but Renoir also constantly and successfully exhibits at the Salon. In 1885, his first son, Pierre, is born, and they start to feel cramped in his studio apartment. Until now, Renoir has been working right at home, but the newborn, who is constantly crying, makes it difficult for the artist to work, and his wife persuades him to find a place to live, separate from the studio. Fortunately, they can now afford it. And for the first time in his life, Renoir moves into a 4-room apartment and is able to separate his work from his family life. He is already 44 years old. In that same year, 1985, Durand-Ruel organizes another Impressionist exhibition in Paris, Not Giving Up. And the exhibition fails spectacularly again. And this next failure has a devastating effect on the Impressionists, on Renoir, and on Durand-Ruel, who was practically ruined. Soon Renoir begins joint exhibitions with the Society of 20 in Brussels. And in 1887, when Queen Victoria was celebrating her Golden Jubilee, at the request of the Queen's confidant, Philip Richburg, he donated several paintings to the catalogue Paintings of French Impressionists as a token of his gratitude. Not just anyone is asked to donate a painting to the Queen. Renoir's status was rising, and in 1890, at the age of 49, he finally married Aline Charigot. Now he is a perfectly respectable family man. And in the same year, Renoir would participate in the Paris Salon for the last time because just a year later he would become famous. He would no longer need to please the public or bow before the Academy. In 1890, 16 years after the first Impressionist exhibition and 20 years after the experiments began, the event that all the Impressionists had been waiting for finally happened, and it would once again change the direction of Renoir's painting. Durand-Ruel, having despaired of winning the favor of European institutions and critics, organizes an Impressionist exhibition in the United States, and it is a resounding success. For the wealthy in the United States, everything that comes from old Europe is seen as a mark of quality, like a luxury brand. And the Impressionist paintings are eagerly bought up. American newspapers write about them, the exhibition becomes a sensation, and Durand-Ruel returns to Europe with the money that saved both him and the Impressionists. But most importantly, he brings back information about the impressive sums paid by American buyers for Impressionist paintings. The mocking name Impressionism turns into an expensive brand. The Impressionists themselves become fashionable artists, and out of all of them, Monet receives the most fame. His stubbornness, perseverance, and loyalty to the ideas of Impressionism pay off handsomely. Within a couple of years, Monet becomes a master, and Impressionism finally gains recognition. Renoir also receives his share. His exhibition in 1892 is very successful. 111 of Renoir's paintings are put on display for the public. Her reaction changes completely. The reflections of light on bare skin no longer seem like corpse-like spots. The broad brushstrokes no longer seem sloppy. And the most important event happens. One of his paintings is finally acquired by an official institution, the Luxembourg Museum in Paris, which is dedicated to collections of living artists. Renoir receives as much as 4,000 francs for it, which is about $100,000 in today's money. Other paintings are also being bought eagerly. After the exhibition, Renoir finally becomes financially secure. At last he is free. At last he no longer has to guess the trends. He can simply do what he likes. And once again, he rejects classicism and returns to his soft and slightly impressionistic painting style. However, the relationship between the artists deteriorates even further. Because Monet's paintings sell for more than Renoir's paintings, this seems unfair to Renoir, and he suffers greatly from such injustice. His paintings cost 3,000 to 4,000, while Monet's sell for 15, and this, of course, increases the distance between them. From Monet's side, because Renoir is a renegade. From Renoir's side, because Monet is more successful. From the early 1890s begins the most mature stage of Renoir's painting, the first phase of which is the so-called mother-of-pearl period. The main painting of this period is considered to be The Girl at the Piano, the very one that was acquired by the Luxembourg Museum. And remaining true to his unique feathered technique, which blurs the boundaries of objects and creates a kind of haze. In his paintings, Renoir changes his palette. It becomes more restrained, almost monochromatic, and this creates an effect of mother-of-pearl, roundness, and shine on the surface of the model's body. In almost all the paintings, you can see the same face. This is Renoir's wife. And in 1894, two major events happen. Renoir suffers his first attack of rheumatism. It was so sudden and severe that the artist's face was temporarily distorted, and all his friends were very frightened, very frightened. This was the first sign of impending trouble, which fortunately passed without serious consequences this time. In the same year, Renoir's best friend, Gustave Caillebotte, passed away. Yes, for many years now, Renoir's best friend has not been Monet, but the banker's son, who was also a painter. Caillebotte, coming from a wealthy family, never tried to compete in skill with Renoir. He always let him take the lead. At the same time, he was very willing to buy his paintings. He bought not only Renoir's works, but also Monet's and those of other Impressionists. Together with Durand-Ruel, saving the Impressionists from starving to death, Caillebotte assembled the most impressive collection of Impressionist paintings. But the most interesting thing is how he managed it. Despite the fact that Impressionists were beginning to be accepted by official and the most prestigious institutions, museums, galleries, and critics still refused to recognize the new, well, not so new movement's right to exist. Hoping to break this barrier, Caillebotte, who came from a well-known wealthy family, wrote a will in which he donated all his paintings to the Louvre, hoping that the Louvre would not dare to refuse. And this would put an end to the ostracism that the Impressionists had been subjected to. That was his little dream, and he made Renoir his executor. Renoir went to the Louvre to settle the matter, but it wasn't that simple. The Louvre representative was not at all pleased with such a gift. "And why did your friend decide to give us a white elephant?" He said to Renoir. "Put yourself in our place. If we accept it, the Institute will come down on us. If we refuse, everyone who supports the movement will attack us. Understand me, Monsieur Renoir. I'm not against modern painting. I believe in progress. I'm a socialist. That says it all." And 2/3 of the paintings from Caillebottes' collection were rejected. The director of the Louvre was especially outraged by Cézanne's paintings. "Don't tell me," he complained, "that Cézanne is an artist. He has money, his father is a banker, and he paints just to pass the time. It wouldn't surprise me if it turns out that he paints with the sole purpose of mocking us." The approved paintings included works by Degas, Monet, Renoir, and Sisley. The rest of the paintings were returned to Caillebottes' wife. After her death, they passed to the children and they hurried to get rid of them. Collectors from the United States eagerly bought up the paintings. And that's how France, having rejected them, ended up with the largest collection of Impressionists in America. The approved third of the collection still didn't make it to the Louvre, but was instead sent to the same Luxembourg Museum. However, even though the entire collection wasn't accepted, it was still a great success. The clever move paid off. For the first time, such a large number of Impressionist paintings was accepted, even if into a secondary, but still a real state museum. The Louvre rejected them twice more until, several decades later, the management simply changed in the administration. And now these paintings are the jewels of the museum's collection. That's how Renoir became the initiator of the first recognition, albeit almost forced, of Impressionist art. He continued to paint, but in 1897, misfortune struck. Renoir and his family, by that time he had 2 more sons, moved for a while to Essonnes, a picturesque place near Paris, and rented a house there. Soon it was there that they would buy their first house, right next door, and Renoir would spend the rest of his life in it. Young artists who admired Renoir often visited them, including Matisse. They all got bicycles to which they attached their painting tools and rode around the area in search of subjects. One fine day, Renoir set off on his bicycle in search of a new subject and he lost control. He fell onto some rocks and broke his right arm. The local doctor put it in a cast and Renoir had to learn to work with his left hand. His wife mixed the paints for him and she also wiped off unsuccessful parts of the painting with a rag soaked in turpentine. After returning to Paris at a Christmas party at Edouard Manet's, he felt pain and the doctor, after examining him, unfortunately said that he had arthritis. Arthritis can't be cured even now, but back then it sounded like a sentence. An artist for whom painting is his whole life could lose the ability to paint. Renoir took the threat seriously and every day before starting work he began juggling 3 balls for 10 minutes. He wasn't very good at it, but he laughed and said that's how it should be. If it were easy, there would be no point in it. But a year later, he had a severe attack and he almost completely lost the use of his right arm. The pain was so intense that Renoir couldn't even touch it. At that time, the artist was painting a lot and selling everything right away. The inability to provide for his family terrified him terribly. And from this time on, Renoir's life turns into a struggle with a terrible illness that will gradually eat away at his body piece by piece. In 1900, when Renoir was already 59 years old, a World's Fair was held in Paris. France sent works by Monet, Pissarro, Cézanne, and Renoir to the exhibition. Renoir sent his painting Young Girls at the Piano. And after the exhibition, the French government decided to award Renoir the Legion of Honor, the highest award in France. Renoir, of course, accepted the award, but he found himself in a very awkward situation. Because by agreeing to accept it, he was in a way making peace with his enemies. He was acknowledging official art, the Salon, the Department of Fine Arts, the Institute. But by refusing, he would be doing what he hated most in the world, a theatrical gesture. He was also worried about the reaction of Monet, who wholeheartedly hated all these conventions and, after decades of suffering and rejection, despised official artistic Paris. After accepting the order, Renoir wrote to Monet, "Dear friend, I let myself be awarded. Believe me, I'm telling you this not to say whether I'm right or wrong, but so that this little piece of ribbon doesn't come between our old friendship." And a few days later, he added a few more words. "Now I'm completely convinced that I wrote you a rather silly letter. What difference does it really make whether I have an order or not? As you can see, even at this respectable age, Renoir is still shy in front of his old friend. Unfortunately, the illness progresses, and in 1902 there is a new attack caused by an old cold, as a result of which Renoir's face loses its mobility. People who saw him during this period for the first time were frightened by the almost motionless mask of his face, but Renoir continued to paint. And from the following year, 1903, the last period in Renoir's life begins. The Red Period, so called because of the predominance of red in his paintings. The daily physical and emotional suffering caused by his illness colors his paintings in anxious tones. Around the same time, Monet develops cataracts and his paintings take on a yellowish hue. But both great artists bravely refuse to surrender to their illness. Renoir doesn't give up, he keeps painting a lot, and his house becomes a frequent meeting place for all kinds of people. He works exclusively with Durand-Ruel out of gratitude for his help when he was poor. And there's already a real hunt for Renoir's paintings. That's why, from time to time, swindlers visit his house to try to get a painting from him. One introduced himself as the adoptive father of Sisley's illegitimate daughter. Another said he was the mayor of the Fontainebleau region, where the young Impressionists began their journey, and asked for a painting to commemorate them, assuring that Monet had already given him two. A shopkeeper who sells forgeries brought one to Renoir, saying he bought it from Durand-Ruel, but claimed that Renoir had supposedly forgotten to sign it. Of course, the forgery was immediately exposed. And another one simply robbed Renoir. He and his family went on vacation and gave the keys to a neighbor, but when they returned, 50 paintings were missing. It turned into a huge scandal. The thief was groveling at the artist's feet and kissing his hands, and Renoir forgave him and didn't report him. But the illness did not go away. In 1912, Renoir found it difficult to walk and he switched to a wheelchair. He developed progressive deformities of his hands and ankylosis of his right shoulder, which required him to adapt his painting technique. In the later stages of arthritis, he painted by tying the brush to his paralyzed fingers. His hands were terribly disfigured. Rheumatism deformed his joints so much that his thumb was bent toward his palm and the other fingers toward his hand. But he painted every day. In 1917, Renoir's painting The Umbrellas was exhibited at the National Gallery in London. For the first time, one of his paintings made it into a top-level museum, but still not in the Louvre. In 1919, Paul Léon, the director of the Department of Fine Arts, invited Renoir to visit the Louvre, which was open just for him. Can you imagine what an honor it was to the Louvre, where his journey in life began? His friends carried him in a chair through all the halls so he could once again enjoy the old masters. A few months later, Renoir died of pneumonia at the age of 78, having lived an incredibly rich life and dying almost with a paintbrush in his deformed hands. After Renoir's death, his children offered his large bathers to the Louvre as a gift, but the stubborn museum refused again, considering the colors too garish. Then the director of the Philadelphia Museum in the United States contacted the sons and offered to buy the painting. Upon learning about this and remembering the recent loss of a priceless collection of Impressionist paintings, the Louvre department quickly changed its mind and finally accepted the gift. Thus, only after his death and with the help of blackmail, Renoir finally made it into the main museum of his beloved France, right next to the old masters who had inspired him on this path. Yes, Renoir was not the most passionate Impressionist. Returning to classicism, he stayed there for a long 10 years, and when he came back, his uncompromising peers had moved far ahead. But people are different. Not everyone is able to struggle for decades like Monet in order to reach their goal. And as you can see, Renoir had many questionable periods, especially the last one, which is also called the sausage period. However, his Impressionist period is undoubtedly talented. The paintings from this period make you want to smile, and his legacy, achievements, and the way he fought his illness impress me. I showed you many paintings that you won't find in the best of Renoir albums, so you could see all sides of this artist, and I hope, with my help, you've been able to form a complete picture. Perhaps those people who demand that Renoir be removed from museums have shaky grounds for it, and Renoir is overrated simply because he was an Impressionist. But something tells me that these people themselves haven't achieved even a fraction of Renoir's success in their own lives. So how are they any different from those Vandals who throw soup at Van Gogh's paintings? So, my friends, that was the real story of the Floatman. Please subscribe to my channel. Ahead are the other 5 Impressionists, as well as Van Gogh, Matisse, Dali, Klimt, Yu, and Schiele. and I guarantee you will learn an incredible amount of interesting and new things.
Goodbye, everyone.